A few years ago, the WHO published a report that forecasted that relatively soon the world population will reach the symbolic number of 10 billions. Now, this poses a number of questions, but one that is relevant to my domain of interest is how can we provide health care to 10 billion human beings spread all over the world? Well, my answer is, and I quote from a famous politician active in Italy during the fascism, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. So we have to look at the problem as they are, but we have to look for the future and be optimists that a solution will eventually be found. What does it mean? Well, let me introduce you to the perspective that we've been developing on this topic. I don't know if you know, but United Kingdom, for a number of reasons, is probably the only country in the world that has the ability to report average life expectancy at birth since 1543. And this, it's extraordinary. And the graph, it's plotted here. And as you can notice, from 1543 until mid-19th century, so for about 300 years, life expectancy at birth was fluctuating, but never exceeding 40 years old. Okay, but then from the second half of the 19th century, it started to climb, and it kept climbing until today. Now, what happened around that period? Well, a few things. For example, in 1818, the first public hospital is opened in London, the Charing Cross. In 1848, it's published the Public Health Act, the first legislation in Europe recognizing the concept of public health. And then a few years after, 1871, the law that makes vaccination compulsory. So the point I'm trying to make is that public health and expenditure in public health is a fundamental determinant in life expectancy. And this is proved by this correlation between the per capita healthcare spending and the life expectancy in many different countries across the world. I use this data to stratify countries in three macroscopic groups. But first, let's exclude every country that have a life expectancy less than 50. Why? Because in this country, usually what is missing are fundamental things like food, water, shelter, or safety. Countries where there is a civil war or other social unrest, famines, etc. So let's exclude this, because here the problem is not healthcare spending, it's something else. Okay. So with this exclusion, we can cluster countries in three groups. A group of countries that spend less than $200 per inhabitant on average per year in healthcare. We call them red countries. Countries that spend between $200 and $1,000, we call them blue country, and countries that spend more than $1,000 per capita. Okay, the question that I'm trying to answer in the next few minutes is, can predictive technology in healthcare help to handle healthcare provision in a world of 10 billion? I believe that the answer is yes, but the type of use change depending on the level of healthcare provision a country can afford. So red countries mostly have accessibility to healthcare, and this is where the technology, in my opinion, can help. Blue countries mostly face excessive costs in biomedical products. And here technology should help to reduce this cost. Green countries have problem of long-term sustainability of universal health care, but I don't have the time to discuss this last point today. So we will focus on red and blue countries. So red countries, countries that spend less than $200 per inhabitant in healthcare on average every year. This country have one major problem. Place where you can get specialistic healthcare, hospitals, are very few in the countries. And this combined to frequently the lack of good mobility infrastructures makes very difficult for many inhabitants to reach a specialistic healthcare. What can the technology do about that? Well, an important thing that is happening is that the coverage for mobile networks is growing constantly worldwide. Of course, again, poorer countries tend to have worse coverages than richer countries, but overall, by now, we expect something like in the order of 60-65% of the world population being covered by at least a 4G network, okay? And these numbers will keep increasing because the technology is getting cheaper and cheaper, more and more powerful. So connectivity is something we will have more and more frequently, even in less developed countries. The other thing that is happening is a rush of consumer electronic level healthcare appliances. This is a snapshot for a consumer show a few years ago, but you know, every year is pretty much the same. There is a flood of health-related products, very simple, very cheap technologies that can be used directly by the patient and that can collect and transmit eventually through a wireless network, through a cellular network, measurements about the healthcare status of that patient. Telemedicine has been extensively discussed in relation to countries that have problems of mobility to reach hospital, okay? This is an example of a pilot project in a rural region of India. But I believe that in silico medicine offer a whole new level of remote care opportunity. Let's take, for example, this example. Say that this patient has a number of symptoms related to his mobility, to his neuromusculoskeletal system. He traveled for days to the closest hospital. He's visited there. They do some imaging. They do some measurements with a biomedical instrumentation. And they decide that, yes, there is a disease. The disease will progress, but it's not to the point where the patient has to undergo a major surgery. But that point may come in the future. So how this patient who leaves days of travel from the hospital can be kept monitored? Well, with the data we collected on the hospital, we can build a digital twin of the patient, a digital twin that can be constantly informed by a very cheap wearable sensor that the patient will be given and brought back home. A sensor that transmits data through the mobile network to the hospital, and when we see that things come to the point when a surgical intervention is needed, we can contact the patient and call him back to the hospital. What about blue countries? I believe that in silico trials can provide affordable innovation. I'm sure you all know the problem. The cost of developing a new medicine has been increasing exponentially, reaching numbers that almost sound ridiculous, $1 billion. Now, we all agree that there is an element of inflation in these figures because the pharma companies use this to justify the very high price of their products. but it is also unquestionable that producing new drugs is becoming more and more complicated. Now, let me do a game with you. Let's imagine that I'm a company that makes airplanes, passenger carriers, okay? Or another company that makes nuclear power plants, like this one. How would you feel if I say, well, I don't know how safe my products are, so I'll make a few copies of them, put them in use, and see what happens? Now, that would be crazy, right? Because the reality is that all these high-risk products, before we even start to manufacture the first copy, they've been tested extensively for all possible scenarios using computer modeling and simulation. And this is true for every single industrial sector nowadays, except one: medicine. Medical products are still tested like in 1,000 years ago, when the canon of medicine was published. You give the new product to some patient and see what happens. It's called a clinical trial. Now, can we use modeling and simulation to speed up and to reduce the cost and the duration of clinical trials? Well, in our opinion, the answer is yes. For example, this technology that we are developing in the framework of the Streetovat European project will allow to test in silico new treatment for tuberculosis, for active tuberculosis. And we will be able to evaluate if a new treatment can reduce the so-called time to conversion when the patient stopped being infective in silico before any patient is actually given the new treatment. Let me give you another example, because this links to the important role that high-performance computing is going to play in this scenario. This is a pipeline that we are developing in our research group that will allow to test new drugs to fight osteoporosis. Now, the main pathological event in an osteoporotic patient is a bone fracture, usually associated to a minor fall or a minor trauma. And among the various fractures, the most severe is the hip fracture. About 20% of the elder who experience a hip fracture dies of related complication within 12 months. So this is a very serious scenario. If we could develop a way to test new drugs in silico, we could do a much better job in developing new solutions. But it's a huge computational cost. I need to simulate the fall of a single patient. It usually takes about 3 core hours to run my model. But because I don't know how a patient falls, I have to describe this as a stochastic process. So I need about 100 simulated falls to sample the probability distribution. But in order to have the same level of evidence of a clinical trial, I need to simulate 1,000 virtual patients. And I cannot simulate only what happens today. I have to follow up my virtual patient for a long time, because osteoporosis is a slow disease, typically 10 years. So this requires about 3 million core hours, which with a single core computer would mean 300 years, okay? But with the new HPC system that will be installed hopefully soon at the Cineca Supercomputing Center in Bologna, we can have an answer in 30 hours using a fifth of the whole supercomputer. So the role of computational power in this context is going to be critical. So in conclusion, I believe that in silico medicine is the future, not only for rich country. I believe that there is enormous opportunity also for developing countries. Technology have to be chosen wisely. They have to be adapted to the specific context of each country, but the use of digital twins in silico trials and personal health forecasting can literally change the face of healthcare provision across the world. Thank you very much.